Welcome to everyone who's joining us right now. We'll give this a few moments to let everybody settle in, grab your cup of coffee. We have a very important conversation about to go on. This is going to be the blend, really the nexus between how data and information, the environment of cardiovascular digital health and health innovation, actually what's the status quo, the state of the community, and where are we going? And I'm thrilled, of course, that we have the benefit of Galen Growth joining us today, and I want to thank them for bringing us together. It's an important conversation. So we'll just wait a few more moments to begin, and then I'll have an opportunity to introduce our amazing, really amazing conversationalists. I say conversationalists instead of a panel because having had the opportunity to know our four discussants personally through many years and watching their careers, following them on social media, I urge you to follow them on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Dr. Albert is particularly active on both, I might add, and he's really sharing some incredible data, clinical data, that shows the validity of health innovation. So by all means, follow him, follow Galen Growth, especially if you want to stay tuned to their upcoming reports. And of course, Tal is on social media as well. So use the opportunity to check in and follow them, please. So we're going to kick off because we only have 1 hour together today, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. This is a fairly important conversation. Just a few weeks ago, Galen Growth issued a report a report, I think, that is really broader than the cardiovascular area. It looks specifically at cardiovascular innovation for a very specific reason. But if you get a chance to access the report, and I believe the report is accessible, the summary of the report, you can go to Galen Growth's website and see the summary report, which is illuminating in itself. I've been blessed to see that what they call the premier report, which is the full document, and to me it is a guide. That report really led to this conversation, this webinar, and the webinar is really taking a look at the data and the real world situation. What is really happening behind the data? And I want to really extend my thanks to Galen Growth for making this conversation possible. Let me introduce everybody here because it really is an exceptional crew of people from the area. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Albert. Dr. Albert is the founder and chief medical officer of AliveCor. AliveCor is a industry pioneer. First of all, Dr. Albert is the driver. He's the inventor. He's the mind behind CardioMobile. And this is really probably one of the most successful cardiovascular digital devices, remote monitoring devices available in the market today. It's not his first enterprise, as a matter of fact, but it is really an outstanding lead in ECG technology. And I want to thank you, Dr. Albert Dave, because as a result of your innovation, countless lives are being sustained and saved. It really is quite remarkable. I hope you'll have a chance to tell us a little bit about what you're doing in relationship to how the category is doing. Now, Dave, Dr. Albert is born and raised in Washington, D.C. I hope he doesn't mind. He comes from a very distinguished family, and he's shaking his head. But actually, I think that Dave got a chance to understand how the ecosystem of things working happened at a young age. Actually, his father is the famed Carl Albert, who was Speaker of the House during particularly Lyndon Baines Johnson, and was actually the family is instrumental to many of the medical access.
Richard Nixon
as well.
Ford. Yeah.
There we go. There we go. But what was really key to this is obviously during your father's term, Medicare and Medicaid came online, and without those two pieces of legislation in 1964, we really wouldn't be discussing affordable care now, because that was the precedent for that. Now, Dave, you're a serial entrepreneur. You have developed other life-saving technologies. You developed one company which was sold to GE. You stayed with GE for quite some time as the chief scientist at GE Cardiology. So I really want to acknowledge that. You've done it again and again and again successfully. It's impressive. It's impressive. I also want to welcome, of course, and I apologize in advance if I slightly mispronounce the name. You'll correct me, please. Sara Schmachtenberg. Say it correctly, please, though, for everybody here.
Schmachtenberg.
Schmachtenberg. And you're the head of data and analytics for Europe and the United States for Galen Growth. You have a PhD from MIT. You really have been looking at digital health and health technology analytics for quite some time. You have 10 years of medical device expertise, looking specifically at corporations, large and small startups, of course. And you've been studying the changing landscape of investment and the category for quite some time. As a way, we could call you the navigator of the digital health category. You know where the dark secrets lie, where we stand, and where we're going. And Sara, thank you, because I'm going to be asking you quite a bit about your expertise in data. Julien de Salaberry is the founder and CEO of Galen Growth. He really is one of the drivers of making these reports available around the world. And Julien, I want to thank you and the community again for not only making this report available to all of us, but in fact, many of your other reports that I've seen that you issued at Vive, you've issued at Health and so forth. So that is fantastic. You really have been guiding institutional investors. You have 25 years of experience in the category. You've worked with major companies like Eli Lilly and Boston Scientific and Baxter and Glaxo and Merck. You have a fantastic understanding of health innovation and the investment community. I hope to draw on that today. And our other panelist is Tal Wenderow. And Tal, did I pronounce that correctly, Tal?
I will say it's close enough, so it's good for now.
Okay, all righty. You also have an incredible track record in health innovation. You're a venture partner in Genesis Medtech. It's a global medical device company, and you're leading Genesis M&A and investment activities there. But you're applying your wisdom at Genesis from experience. You co-founded a company in vascular robotics. It was acquired by Siemens Healthineers for about $1 billion, I might add, just a few years ago. You went on to be executive vice president and international business development for the enterprise. Then you went and worked on another startup that I think is really at the very beginning, cutting edge of where we'll look at medicine in the future, where we'll understand that it's us. We are a diagnostic tool. You created Vocalis, and you understand that voice is a biomarker that can indicate disease. You serve on a number of boards, corporate boards and private boards. So from an inventor, from an investor, from a leader, you bring that wisdom from having to make the hardcore decisions of where do we put the money. So for our audience, I just want to sort of bring the wealth of the panel to your attention. We have people who are looking at the category, analyzing it. I think that your current report, if I'm not mistaken, Sara, analyzed some 250 million data points. Is that correct?
I think it's even more than that by now, but yeah, we'll go with that.
Okay, at that point when the report came out, I think it said 250, and I think you look at something like 14,000 ventures. So you span sort of the globe of ventures. So Sara, you're going to be the keeper of that. Obviously, Dr. Albert has someone who has really built companies to scale again and again in the cardiovascular area. Julien is the driver behind really bringing big industry, big health and startups together to look at this so that we can essentially make innovation available to improve the human condition. Tal, you bring the wisdom of someone who has built, sold, and now invests. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to start off with the first question to you, Sara, and then Dave, Dr. Albert, I'd like you to listen closely. I'd like your perspective. So Sara, this report, which I've gone through a few times, and I urge everyone listening in or will watch the video to download the report from your website. It's illuminating. You really talk about not just cardiovascular health, but all the major categories of therapeutic digital health innovation. Could you just summarize a bit what made this report so unique in your eyes beyond the numbers, and we're going to get into some of those numbers. I think they tell a very important story for the going forward. But give us a summary of the report.
Randy. And what was so interesting for me being in digital health and writing this report is that you realize cardio is really core to digital health. Digital health grew up with cardiovascular diseases, right? Starting with remote devices, going into the patient solutions, right? Apps, disease management, and finally getting into more of the AI and the medical diagnostics, right? This is the path of cardiovascular diseases in digital health and also digital health in general, right? And right now, if we look at where we are in 2023 with cardiovascular disease in digital health, everyone knows funding is going down. Yeah, we got that. But you really see the partnerships going up. Cardiovascular partnerships are focused 23% on health systems, right? It's really, if you're in this area, health systems are going to be the partner to get your solutions into the market. So that's what we can show based on the numbers and the partnerships that we have recorded in Health Tech Alpha, right? And really one place that I found cardiovascular ventures really stand out is in clinical evidence, right? We're talking about clinical evidence is what's going to be needed in the future going forward in order to get funding, in order to be established. And cardiovascular disease has the highest percentage of ventures with clinical evidence across the entire industry, right? So there are a lot of points where cardiovascular ventures stand out, right? Yes, it's a mature category, but there's a lot of potential remaining. And we really look forward to following it in the future and understanding how this potential works out.
Well, I think you've given us the tip of the iceberg, Sara. Thank you very much. Now, Dave, Dr. Albert, I wanted to ask you, you've built companies to scale. A lot of the companies that the report looks at, and a lot of the companies I speak to are at the startup stage. You have found the magic to go from startup to global enterprise relatively consistently. And you're a scientist. I follow your social media feeds very closely. You're often sharing clinical insight. To Sara's point, where she talked about clinical validation, could you share with us a little bit about what you're doing at AliveCor, but also your thought about the importance of what she just said about the importance of clinical evidence?
Well, that's the foundation. I'm always commenting when a startup leads with a press release. And my standard comment is lead with peer-reviewed published data, not a press release. Very seldom, never, will you have an accepted innovation in any part of medicine, cardiovascular medicine or anywhere else, without the clinical proof. You won't get regulatory approval, whether it's CE mark or FDA clearance. Without that validation, you won't get acceptance by the medical community. And so, digital health has a lot of participants, a lot of startup founders who don't come out of healthcare. I guess because I have 40 years, I graduated from medical school in 1981 from Duke. And so I have over 40 years in the medical industry. And so I understood how things work traditionally, 25 years ago, what you had to do to have an innovation accepted. And today, there are a lot of startup founders who don't know that. So they come in thinking it's a tech industry, move fast and break things, I think is Mr. Zuckerberg's mantra. And unfortunately, in healthcare, I have another saying: people here handle with care. You can't afford to break people. You must be very careful. So it's a different paradigm. And I think we at AliveCor now have over 200 peer-reviewed publications validating our technology in a variety of applications, some on-label, some off-label. And I think what you have to do is lead with your evidence. And that's where Sara's absolutely right. Partnerships. How does a startup that may not have huge resources develop clinical validation? Well, they partner with an IDN, with a health system, with a hospital, with physicians who can get the IRB approvals, get the ethics approvals, can recruit the patients, can conduct the validation studies. So to Sara's point, in order to, a lot of these startups need to find partnerships to enable them without having to spend the millions of dollars that a traditional clinical trial costs to get their validation data. And I think that's a critical element.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I'm just going to swing over to Tal on that, because Tal's been in the seat of sort of starting it up, having built a company, sold it, and starting it up another company. And Tal, I wanted to get your perspective on what Dave just shared, what Sara shared, because you're now in the investment seat. You're having to make decisions of where to put an enterprise's money. So I'd love to hear from you specifically. You know, Dave really just talked about how do you establish your value and your credibility? On what platform does it stand? You know, Sara talked about how the analysis of the data lets them see distinctly that those enterprises that are more successful are pursuing clinical evidence. From an investment standpoint, someone asked to meet with you. You're sitting on the other side of the table from them. You've been on both sides of the table, both the seeking investment and now giving investment. Could you share with us a little bit of the secret sauce of some of the things you're looking at Genesis Medtech?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I always sit in both sides because I'm a builder by heart, right? So I always think about both sides when a technology or even a product comes to mind. And I completely agree with what Dr. Albert said. It's all about how does it impact the patient? Meaning there are startups in the digital health that look into call it hospital efficiency and care path efficiency, which is a different category of how do you mobilize the patient, how do you manage the patient. But if you look on the patient benefit, that validation is key because you see in healthcare today the convergence of a lot of fields, whether it's big tech, and David will probably be the first one is saying competing with Apple and Samsung that you never heard about, right? Or Salesforce.com that goes into healthcare. And then you have the traditional medtech and pharma that are trying to converge and how far do I go to the patient at home? And how far do I follow the patient? And you're starting to hear more and more in healthcare, you know, CAC and patient retention and all that. But in the end of the day, there is an individual patient, right? And how do you care to that individual patient? And how do you personalize that? Especially when you see more and more in the AI, because you see solutions that say, hey, we have accuracy of 90%. That can be good, but in healthcare, it can be bad if you do a lot of false positive, because there's patient anxiety. And how do you account for those things? So unfortunately, I don't have the magic wand. Otherwise, we'll be having a different discussion. But I think it's more about bringing that to that individual patient journey and follow that patient and put yourself in that position and see, can it help? Can it help the patient outcome? If you help with patient outcomes, that's the best. That's end of discussion, right? You know, a JAC or Nature article about patient care, you get the funding, right? If you don't get that, you start looking to cost reduction efficiency or more second layer benefits, which is harder to prove, especially with it's when you think about investment, it's a net sum game. Because if you take someone to pay you, you're going to have to take it from someplace else. You cannot invent more money, right, in the healthcare system.
This is so important. Yeah, so important. So we're seeing sort of the weave of this. And Julien, I wanted to take what Tal just said in terms of the patient and sort of bring this over to you for a second. You and Galen have been generous in sharing these data publicly. I know that the premier reports are part of your business model, but the basic reports you put out there for society. I wanted to get a sense of vision for you because I'm one of those people who really looks at your report more than any other report. There are other reports there. I won't mention their names. They deal with numbers. You know, they talk about total investment. That's a sliver of what you and the Galen Growth team are doing in terms of total investment. You're looking at many different factors to create sort of a more 360-degree view of this. How would you imagine our listeners, our marketplace using these data to make decisions that people like Dave and Tal have to make every day? I mean, what is your vision behind that?
Thanks, Gil. Vision, I guess we're trying to come at it from two angles. One is demystify what's truly happening in digital health, so as to help the whole, I guess, dialogue move away from the glass half empty to the glass half full. and the sheer benefits of technical and technology innovation in digital health, via digital health in the realms of healthcare. Too often we see the media talking about all the data breaches or physicians who are finding it hard to squeeze in technology and so on and so forth. So it tends to be a bit of a negative note. So we're trying to make sure that everybody sees what is truly happening across the globe, in as many countries as possible. The approach we take in terms of the data points you're referring to is trying to get beyond hype and bias, trying to get to a data-driven approach to evaluating what a product or its founding company is actually truly doing in the space. And it really emanates from a pain point I experienced when I was working in Big Pharma, when every time I wanted to get answers to specific critical due diligence questions, I could not get them from any ready-made source. I had to go and find them the hard way. And so we wanted to remedy that and created Galen Growth. And more subsequently, of course, we launched a platform called HealthTech Alpha, where all this data is held and where our clients are able to interrogate the data directly. But the important thing is to be able to, more than ever now, as you just pointed out, Gil, and as David also pointed out, and more recently Tao as well, which is about proof points. It's really getting into under the bonnet and having a look at truly what is that venture doing, what difference is actually making at a patient level or at an HCP level, or even at the drug research level, depending on where on that healthcare value chain that specific innovator is trying to impact. So we wanted to get beyond funding and really get into the questions people are truly asking and trying to understand what a specific venture is doing, and therefore, as you aggregate it up to ecosystem, is what's the actual ecosystem up to. And for anyone who's reading our reports like yourself, Gil, over the last few months, the highlights or headlines you get out of cardiovascular are very different to the ones you get out of the oncology report that we published last month, for example, for reasons that a lot of our viewers can probably rapidly get to. But then when you get into the detail, you realize how different the focus areas are, where the money's going, etc.
Taking everything that you've said, I want to swing back to Sara now and get under the hood a little bit. And I hope Sara won't mind a pressing question. I wanted to compare a few data points and bring them together. And that's the beauty of the Galen Growth Report, is that it allows the astute reader of the report to see connective tissue. So on one hand, cardiovascular investment is declining compared to other therapeutic categories. On the other hand, and Dave could really speak to this, cardiovascular health is so connected to other disease states. I think one of sadly, the leading causes people die from cancer therapy or during cancer therapy is often clots. They have clots. So, did they die from the cancer? Did they die from the clot? How is that recorded, of course, in terms of the need? And then, of course, we see that there's a decline of, I think there was a decline of 31%, 31% in the cardiovascular category. But then I see later on the report that more money is going into the startup area, which requires less money to get more sort of like voice or control over the enterprise. So on one hand, I see the number going down. On the other hand, I see it going to a different stage of the evolution of the company where less money is needed for more control. And I also see money being spread around diabetes. So that's a cardiometabolic disease, right? Right, Dave? Wouldn't you agree to that? Cardiometabolic, right? Nodding away. It's cardiometabolic disease. Steve, neurology, I'm dealing with a stroke. That's cardiovascular related, isn't that, Dave? Right? Stroke, right. So I see these like neurology as something, but are we getting to a place where cardiovascular medicine is kind of like a planet with moons connected to it? And is the money being diffused in other subsectors of cardiovascular health? Is it truly declining, or is it getting more influential? That's putting you on the hard spot as being a data analyst. But I think our listeners now and watching the webinar would be really thrilled to get your perspective of someone who ties it all together.
I think you're absolutely right, Gil. You have a good point in that we do track in Health Tech Alpha, right? The data we use, we do track if a venture has multiple therapeutic areas, right? We consider all of those. So cardiovascular does consider all those different areas, but as we get down to the levels of personalized medicine, right? As you're peeling away the peels of the onion to understand what is the underlying cause, right? That's where you absolutely get to this linkage and the overlap that we see, right? So digital health venture funding in general is going down, right? I think we all know that on this call, whether or not it's going to the different areas, you definitely have this this overlap that you're talking about. And now you're saying, okay, depending on your cardiovascular state, you could have, you know, different effects with neurology, with oncology. So we're definitely reaching those levels in digital health where you have to consider the whole ecosystem. And we have a map showing how cardiovascular diseases and the different areas that ventures look at as a whole, right? And you're seeing that there's a lot of ventures looking at more than just cardio, right? Looking at the neurology, looking at mental health, looking at even women's health, right? Hormone. So this interconnectivity and almost a platform caring for the whole patient, right? Rather than just looking at one disease area is a really fantastic trend that we see in digital health that will help get away from the point solutions and get into the patient care.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And Dave, I wanted to ask you a related question. You're not just an entrepreneur and an inventor, you're a passionate physician. And I know I see this in anybody who follows you and watches what you're writing, what you're saying, how you're a champion for AliveCor and AliveCor related technology. I want to get your perspective on this because you've talked a little bit about, you know, publishing data on indication, other potential indications. Cardiovascular medicine is such a broad category. I don't think we really appreciate it. I just wanted to get your take on, when you're looking at the future of the category in terms of digital health, where do you see the category going? It can be from an AliveCor perspective or from the sense of someone who's really combination of guru and Yoda of our category. Give us some guidance.
Well, first of all, if you're going to be successful, you need to pick your problem you're going to address first. And we still have some big problems: sudden cardiac death, heart failure, stroke, atrial fibrillation. Each one of those are many, many billions of dollars of expense in the United States alone every year. And so when you say cardiovascular, you mentioned it. Chemotherapy, there are many very effective chemotherapy agents that are cardiotoxic. And so monitoring cardiotoxicity in a variety of ways, my company is involved with some major pharma companies monitoring cardiotoxicity. You know, well, the cancer's gone, but the patient died of heart failure. No, that's a bad outcome. That's not what you want. And so, you know, we have moved and will continue to move more and more care out of the hospital and to the home. So Medicare funded hospital at home. That's where we're taking acute care patients and treating them at home with IVs and oxygen therapy and basically everything short of intensive care and surgery. And so I think you can see the time when cardiovascular medicine, you know, we're already pushing people after bypass surgery, after stents, after ablations, out of the hospital in 24 hours, in 48 hours. This is common around the world as we try to become more efficient. And so digital health is basically the connection directly to the patient. That's what it means. It's empowering the patients, it's caring for the patients, it's getting the patients to care about their own care. And so that's what really started digital health. And I think when you see, I'm not an expert on the funding, so I can't comment except to say that we have a number of relatively mature digital health companies in cardiovascular medicine now, okay? And to invest in those, my company, who are my investors? Ever heard of GE Healthcare? Themselves, a brand new standalone public company. Omron, go into any drugstore, buy a blood pressure cuff. Qualcomm, every cell phone you pick up has Qualcomm in it. and then a little healthcare entity called the Mayo Clinic. On my investors are my validation. Why? Because we pick specific problems to go after, and they now recognize, like pharma, they're dipping their toes into digital health to go directly to patients. And I think what you're seeing is the maturity level of companies like AliveCor, and then investors like Tal or other venture capital investors are looking and saying, where do I get a better bang for my buck? Because those companies are getting investment from, the AliveCors are getting investment from strategic partners and healthcare enterprises. So where am I going to put my money for a potential bigger bang for the buck? And that's why funding may be going down, but as you say, it's moving to startups where the potential bang for the buck is much greater. Invest. And by the way, we also, there's something I want to bring up, and I want Tal to comment and everybody to comment. SPACs. We just went through a gimmick time. Okay. It was a gimmick of how you take your companies public. We had cardiovascular companies. We had all kinds of digital health companies. They're all at a fraction of the valuation they had 2 years ago, a fraction. Many of them are public companies with sub $50 million market caps, and they're doing reverse stock splits and all kinds of things. And I would love to hear Tal talk about it, because that is part of the reason why we have a decrease in funding, because a lot of people got burned badly. Investing in a $10 a share, and it's 30 cents a share now. So I'd love to hear about that, because that really impacted digital health funding farther down. So there's my comment, and I'd love to hear everybody else talk about SPACs, because it's kind of the four-letter word.
I think we'll get to that. Something.
Yeah,
I think we'll get to that, because I look at, obviously everybody's looking at, Babylon Health and what happened there, of course. And, that's a real bellwether. And I think, Dave, you touched on this, the balance between the pizzazz and the economics of service. And we'll give everybody a few moments to think about that. Let me step back, because you're right. I think Tal is the next one to go to. Tal, I think we've heard a question within these statements, which is, to some extent, who is the customer? Who's the customer? Is Dr. Albert, Dave talked about, what are we doing for the patient? You talked about that as well. But let's face it, the patient isn't the investor. When you're sitting there for Genesis Medtech, you're the investor, and you may be channeling the needs of the patient, but you're thinking about, and I know that you've been there before, who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for this? Where's the reimbursement going to be? What are the other companies? Is the company saturated? Has AliveCor been so good at what it does and constantly innovating and reaching out and partnering? Is the bar of entry for another company in that sector so much higher that investors say, don't go there? They've got it locked up. So I want to ask you to put on both hats right now. You've been head of companies that have had to be out there banging on doors for money. Now you're the guy who people bang on your door, and you have to make a decision on investment. Who's the customer? What do you think about?
Yeah, meaning there are obviously multiple stakeholders, right? And we all can name it the 4P, whatever you want to call them. But I think in the end of the day, and I will not go to that mousetrap of the SPAC, because that's a 30-minute discussion that none of us understand about public market, besides ruining the field. What I see, and I personally believe is that the digital health as a category, it's actually does bad service to the field, because in my opinion, it's evolution of our field. Like, you have more and more smart devices. And when you look in the Galen report, some of the companies are like Viz.ai or Cathlux or others are digital companies that are providing cardiovascular solutions specifically to the patient and patient data. So where's that line? And I think, meaning I'm basically believe more in disruptive technology. I'm not kind of like a Me Too kind of guy that will go after Me Too. Although when you look at a portfolio from a strategic, you want some buckets that you just have to add to your portfolio. But you have more and more smart devices, and Dr. Albert mentioned heart failure. This is the biggest problem. You actually see a lot of PE coming right now to heart failure in the US and buying clinics to manage heart failure better. what is that, Dave, 40 or 50% readmission in the first 30 days of heart failure patient. How do you manage them? How do you release them? And it's not one size fit all. Each patient is different. So how do you get all this data so that the patient can provide the input? He cannot make that decision, but also how do you simplify the data in the end that the physician, the healthcare system can actually make the decision, because too much data is not good. So again, there's a lot of trends that are converging. I actually like the play between pharma and medical device and where's that line comes into play. And more companies are trying to look from a strategic point of view, what's my next growth engine, right? And in cardiovascular, it used to be devices, stents, and now going into neurovascular and transcatheter valves. I think heart failure and managing heart failure post, meaning also in the acute phase, but also pre and post. And we, in healthcare, we tend to treat more the post and the acute, not the pre. And that's where LifeCo is trying to do, right? Let me raise a flag. That's what we try to do in Vocalis. Let me raise a flag before you get the acute one, before you start compressing, and you can go to that physician and initiate that contact, because most of healthcare is reactive right now. You go to the physician when you have a problem, and the physician doesn't have a time to come to you before that. Yeah. So I think that's what digital health.
The concept of sick care, a sick care system where we really have to embed and engage, to your point, and what Dave and LifeCo are doing is, how do we engage early enough where we can actually intervene? Sort of preventive cardiology as opposed to reactive cardiology is key. Thank you for that. And now, Julien, I have a sort of an operational question for you about the Galen growth reports, because a lot of our wisdom is really generated from what we read, our experience, our putting ourselves out there, our listening objectively. But I find that the Galen growth report is different than other reports I go through. Again, I didn't want to mention other names. A lot of companies mention deal flow, deal size, how many deals. Galen growth is going through this in a whole different analytic approach. And I wanted to ask you a really tough question. I hope you don't mind, but in a few moments, how would you recommend people actually use the report? In other words, aside from reading it page by page, for me, I do read the report, but I don't look at it in a linear way. That's how my mind works. I tend to look at it, sort of like a puzzle. And I find I get a lot from it when I'm presenting and I'm citing the report. I get a lot of interaction around the report. But I wanted to ask you, do you have a recommendation for how people should use Sara and Sara's team's work, which is phenomenal, if you know how to use it effectively? So let's say in your big clients, let's say in Eli Lilly or Glaxo or Merck or whoever, or Boston Scientific or Medtronic or whatever, they get the report. How would you recommend actually they use the report to make the decisions that Tal has to make?
That's a fantastic question, because we constantly work also with these large organizations in the pharmaceutical and the medical device and the insurance space and the financial services industry. But if you take a Merck or a GSK, as you referred to, Gil, there are two challenges facing anyone trying to spearhead innovation within those organizations. One, of course, is facts, figures that enable them to make winning decisions. But actually, their biggest challenge, one that's always understated or not stated, is the change in management inside the organization. And that is helping decision makers at a senior level in these organizations understand that innovation is going on, understand that their competition is leveraging that innovation, but also understand that the molecule is not the only strategy of the business. And therefore, leverage that report either in its whole or in snippets to educate, inform, and therefore get buy-in from senior decision makers in the digital health innovation strategy of the overall business. So that's what we strongly recommend, and how we help our clients certainly leverage that. But for those who are not our clients but still accessing the report, to do exactly the same thing. Now, the business analysts within those teams access the data that sits behind that report through the database that we built called HealthTech Alpha, and of course they leverage it for their own purposes. The pretty classical use cases are they're looking at understanding an overall ecosystem, such as, for example, what's happening in cardiovascular in a specific market, or they look at it to identify specific pieces of innovation that they want to work with to solve a pain point, or they are literally doing comp intel, understanding what their competition is doing, and therefore should they be doing something similar or not, for that matter. Some of the larger players, you mentioned, I think, GSK or Roche or Novartis, etc., are sitting on phenomenally large portfolio of digital health partnerships. Some are dead, some are kind of sitting in the irrelevant box, and some of them are still very active and true to strategy. And so some of those larger clients leverage our team, so Sara and her team, but also our data to get to rapid decisions as to what's fit for purpose within that portfolio, remembering that some of these actors have been engaged with digital health for at least 10 years now, and of course have built these portfolios with restructures in the way, decision makers changing, etc. So it's a very dynamic space. The segue to that is we're also challenging thinking, and I guess building on what Dave was saying, and keen to get David's point of view here. We're actually in cardiovascular seeing a fair amount of disinvestment from pharma, for whom there is little money to be made in cardiovascular, so they're all charging forward into rare diseases, oncology, etc. And we're still seeing med dev or medical devices very much too much focus, let's say, on product and continuing to iterate innovation as relates to implants, etc. And so really trying to borrow from your go-to-market strategy here, David, where do you see, or where do you encourage innovators in cardiovascular to focus in order to get growth, get scale?
David, do you want to take that?
Well, I can just say, today, antihypertensive medications are virtually all generic.
Yeah.
Statins, generic.
Yep.
Yes, we have the new cardiometabolic wonder drugs, the GLP-1s, GP agonists, and that is a giant area of innovation in pharma, whether it's Novo, the pioneer, or now the fast follower Lilly, and all the other companies that see, oh, by the way, obesity, type 2 diabetes, these are global epidemics. And when you treat them, by the way, you're also treating their hyperlipidemia, you're treating their hypertension. These are wonder drugs, along with what we call the SGLT2s and the PCSK9s. Don't you love the acronyms? I mean, there is some innovation. The GLP-1s are a huge area of innovation, but the bottom line, antihypertensive medications, statins, these are generic drugs, so there's no investment. Where is their investment? Well, we just came off and still are in anticoagulant, the direct anticoagulants that replace warfarin. So you have Eliquis and Xarelto. Xarelto was the first, the Janssen Bayer drug, fast followed by the BMS Pfizer drug Eliquis, which was twice a day, but by the way, is safer and better. So took over the market. Okay, now what's everybody working on? Those were factor 10 drugs, factor 11. So there's a huge amount of innovation and clinical validation studies of what do we call factor 11 drugs, which promise to be potentially just as effective at anticoagulating someone, but safer, so that if you fall off your bike or you trip and you hit your head, you won't die. Okay, that's still a risk with anticoagulation, and a major one that keeps people from really wanting to take those drugs or maintain their anticoagulant. And we know, if you have atrial fibrillation, you have 5 times the risk of stroke of someone who doesn't have atrial fibrillation. And so anticoagulation is a foundation to the treatment of atrial fibrillation. And so, better, faster drugs. Well, guess what? Those drugs will be on patent. That means their prices will be higher, like the GLP-1s. And so you have a lot of innovation. What's it doing? It's the old movie, Tom Cruise, show me the money. Where is innovation going? Where they can have a proprietary patented solution And that's true in cardiovascular medicine, but it's also true, obviously, in cancer, in rare diseases, where you have small markets, but huge prices. And so and protected markets because of legal, trying to innovate and stimulate innovation. So I would tell you, we still have people in medical devices, TAVR. So Edwards pioneered TAVR, but now you've got every medical device company, whether it's the aortic valve or the mitral valve, coming in with a device solution for what used to be surgery and now being a less invasive solution. And why? You know what a TAVR costs? It's way over $100,000 for the procedure and the device and everything. Again, it's follow the money. So stents, very little innovation. Why? Because they don't cost very much money anymore. You can only get a couple $100 from the NHS and Medicare. So you have very little innovation in stents. You have a lot of innovation in less invasive valve replacements. Again, it's follow the money. And what is digital health? Well, digital health isn't high dollar. So you've got all of these organizations, whether it's traditional medical device or pharma companies, that are sitting there saying, yes, we have to address the patient when their customers used to be the doctors and hospitals. You sold defibrillators and pacemakers to the hospitals, and you convinced the doctors to say, buy that device. But today, a lot of that's gone to buying groups. And so you've got to find, how do you impact your strategic business plan? You go to the patients, and digital health at its foundation is about empowering the patients, engaging them in their own care. And so I think that's where we'll see innovation, but the traditional pharma and med device companies are conservative. They're innovators, but they're still conservative business model people who look at quarterly reports and things, and they look at digital health and are entering it delicately. Let me put it that way.
Hold that right there, Dave. That's such a great point. Tal, something that you've mentioned before, and just pick up on what Dave was talking about, Dave he's a disruptor. And you mentioned that in your portfolio, you want to balance, disruptive companies, non-disruptive companies. Something that you've recognized in your own journey as a CEO is that a product is a journey. It's not a single event. And I wanted to get your perspective on what Julien and Dave just talked about in terms of follow the money. Obviously, disruptive, technology can do that, but yet it's a journey. As someone who sort of sits in that chair, what's your thought about that?
There's a lot of thoughts about that. I think it's all start with, I agree with both Dave and Julien about follow the money, but I'll go back to what Dave mentioned earlier. It's all about the patient. So you have to follow the money, but see that there's any added value to the patient, because that's the easiest path. And I've been a startup all my life, right? So only the last 18 months, I went to the strategic, started looking to portfolio review. And as a strategic, you think about two things. One is, how do I grow my business, right? And how do I maintain my market share? Two, how do I don't cannibalize my own business? And a lot of strategics are actually afraid of that, right? If I sell more digital solution, what happened to my high-making devices? And what happened to all the sales channel and commercial channels that I put in place? And third is, what's my next growth engine? These are the three things we're looking at, right? And you have companies, and I think if I will speak with a young me, I'll say, pick your partners wisely, that one, give you the length of funding and experience to go the long run, because it takes time, meaning it's disruptive technologies or new technology. It's not a 2 years, right? And everyone put the hockey stick in their slide deck, and then you stretch that like in 10x magnification on the real life. And second is not everyone are innovators, right? Meaning there are a lot of companies saying that they're innovators, but in the end of the day, they are not. And they are just trying to make the next quarter, as Dave mentioned. I think Edwards actually is a good company to look on innovator. They are actually really define themselves. I only do innovative products. I still think there's a lot of opportunity in smart device and digital health. There's a lot of opportunity in all the patient management and engagement. The question when I see startups is asking, what's your path? Are you a standalone solution like a LifeCore, which means you need $100 million check by definition, right? Because that's what it takes. You can cut the cost of clinical trial today because of the digitalization of that infrastructure, but then you have an extra cost of selling directly to the patient that it's a lot of money. Meaning I still see a LifeCore ads on doing ESPN or whatever it is. I'm smiling every time, but I know how much it costs. So it costs more, it takes more journey, or are you an add-on to a solution right now, whether it's a TAVR solution, whether it's a heart failure solution. And I think that's part of the Galen growth can try to look into trends and what are the trends and how do I position my personal solution, add-ons or disruptive that have to go all the way.
Important insights. Now, Sara, let me take that and return to you because we're talking about trends. And I want to ask you a two-part question. One, the cardiovascular report. Can you, aside from the data that's on the pages, if you were to shift from being a data analyst to a bit of a futurist and looking at this and saying, okay, what are we going to look at least in the coming year or so as a basis of these data? Do you care to take the plunge into the pool and give us your assessment?
Well, what we saw, we look at digital health through clusters, right? And to kind of reflect what Dr. Albert was really talking about, moving the patient out of the hospital into the home, right? We saw health management solutions, which is where, patient, we saw care coordination really jump up in H1 of this year. And that's really moving the patient out of the hospital into the home. And we really do see, although maybe you don't need as much funding in care coordination as you need in medical diagnostics, just because of the nature of those two different businesses, really that home care, getting the patient into the home is an area that's going to really blossom. And that's what we've seen so far in the trends, and we expect to see that further.
Thank you for that. So let me do unfortunately, I wish we could go on for another hour. It's amazing how quickly an hour flies in a conversation like this. I want to do sort of a little bit of a quick round robin on this and ask sort of a poignant question. The concept of the Galen growth data, the investment, we're looking at partnerships, were in a way, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Julien, in a way, if I read the report as I do, and I extrapolate from the report, not the data, but the processes, are you indirectly to the startup category or to the entrepreneurial category? Are you kind of also indirectly giving them a template for their business plan of what matters? Partnerships, clinical evidence, investment. Are you really touching on the core aspects of what a business has to look at and building out its model? So I know that Sara is busy, sort of slicing and dicing the data of like 14,000 ventures. This is what we see. But when I look at it from the point of view of the entrepreneur who's also been on the private equity side, I kind of say to myself, hey, folks out there, if you damn read the report, you'd see, like what you respect, what you inspect. If Galen Growth is inspecting these data, you better respect it and build your business plan out according to this. And I think Tal and Dave touched on these points again and again and again. Am I right or wrong here?
I think you're absolutely right. Sun Tzu's Articles of War, one of them is that all wars are won before they even fought, because, of course, if you've done the right level of espionage and information gathering, you've got a much better picture than your enemy, let's say. So try to convert that into more sort of commercial business context, taking my military hat off. Absolutely, we are equally trying to provide the right insights, wood for the trees vision to our larger corporates in the same way to the innovator themselves, and not just in the way in which they build their pitch deck to position it in the right way, but more importantly, having a better understanding of what are those drivers of scaling, those drivers of being relevant to the ecosystem they're trying to be relevant to in order to attract funding, in order to scale, in order to ultimately make a difference at the patient level or the HCP level, or the other end of the value chain, of course, at an R&D level, depending on, of course, what their innovation is bringing to the table. So yes, Gil, we like to work with investors. We like to work with the strategics, so that are, you know, health systems, as well as, of course, pharmacos. But more importantly, we really do like to work with the innovators themselves, and we encourage them to engage.
Thank you. And Tal, I wanted to swing from that because you've been on both sides of the table. You constantly live in this duality of feeling like you're an entrepreneur of a startup, and also you're an investor. And you know, I have often found in meeting with companies, large and small, that I'm really struck by the gaps in their business plan, their business model. You know, I often ask them about, well, how are you going to get someone to pay for this? What's the reimbursement model? What's the business model? They really know a lot about the technology of what they're doing, but they don't know a lot about the health ecosystem. Looking at that report, thinking of your experience, what's your key advice to people who are knocking on your door?
I think it's hire the right people, right? As simple as that, because as you know, Dave mentioned, there are people coming from the high-tech industry, don't know about healthcare. Sara coming from Medtech, which I am, that don't know about providers, payers, and how do you sell to patient, what's the messaging to patient, and how do you combine them both together? I think that's a specialty that is still enhancing and increasing as we speak, and more experience of a life core, and hopefully not a lot of people will leave a life core, but they will start their own companies based on that experience, and that will be the ripple effect. So in my opinion, it's all about educating ourselves and the people to be better, and that kind of like will fire back into more funding, better solution that optimize. So I look always on team number one, and if you look on most successful ventures, in my opinion, they all had to change direction at one point of time, whether it's the indication, whether it's who is the customer, whether it's how do you position the product, and you have to be able to have that investors, strategics, partners, and leadership to be able to analyze the data and make that switch midway through.
That's great advice. Now, Dr. Alpert, if anybody could write a book on successful ventures and why, it's probably you in this field. You've done it more than once. Each one has been a success. You've been inside of the behemoth, you know, sort of like this sense of GE cardiology. You've seen how these big companies work. You've gone off and done it again and again. I would appreciate your reflection on not just cardiovascular digital innovation, but cardiology innovation overall. Do you have any insight you'd be willing to share with our audience today?
Well, I think it started in Tal talked. Start with a big problem. You know, look for a big problem that doesn't have anything close to a perfect solution today. He mentioned heart failure. It's a global problem. It's a huge problem. It's an expensive problem, and it doesn't have, you know, it doesn't have an inexpensive solution. And so that yearns for innovation. Same thing with you know, a lot of areas today. We have heart attacks. I can tell you that we have outstanding therapy. We can open a coronary artery up, we can stop a heart attack, but only if you come in within the first couple of hours. So if you come in 8 hours later because you didn't recognize you're having a heart attack, we can't help you nearly as well.
Stay there. I have a question to this statement, because you were unique in that you were a physician and inventor in your mindset, in your psyche or genome. Most doctors finish medical school and they have almost no training. Maybe they had a few-hour lecture on digital health and its application, and then they go out to residency and they begin to learn. How do we, from your perspective, because you've had to do it, how do we create waves of let's say cardiologists or doctors who are upskilled, who have the knowledge base to say, we're definitely going to be doing this, or I recommend this to you? How do we make that happen?
Well, first of all, it's happening because the doctors that are being trained today were basically digital natives. They grew up with smartphones and the web and laptops and Wi-Fi. They don't need education. It was just part of their life. It's the people who are caught, I'm old. And so when I left clinical medicine, it was in the 1980s, it was not something you did. Okay. And I was very fortunate. Today, I have scores of physicians coming to me saying, I want to do what you did. And there are many more people finding non-traditional paths to using their medical training in pharma, in medical device, in digital health. And I think, so I'm not worried about the education. There was a question about how do we get more doctors to understand and how do we get more patients? Well, by the way, patients, not every consumer is a patient, but every patient is a consumer. And so we need to take lessons from the consumer businesses about how you approach and how you sell digital health. Because look at Procter & Gamble, right? They know how to sell to a consumer. Well, we need to learn those lessons, and we had a life for it. We have ads on TV. Well, why do we have ads on TV? Why don't you have digital ads? We have those too. But the average age of our customers is over the age of 60. Why? Because they're patients. Again, not every consumer is a patient, but every patient is a consumer. And so we have to go find those people who still watch Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, CNN, Fox News, you name your poison. And people say, oh, you're backing Fox News. No. I would tell you that the people that watch there are probably in a demographic at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. I took a Hippocratic oath. I don't care if you're red, blue, pink, or green. I'm here to help you. And that's
Absolutely.
the goal of Alive Core. I don't care what your politics are. I don't care what your skin color is. We're here to help you. And so that we find the path to those people who need help. And that's I would just tell you, that's the essence of digital health, going to the patient.
That's beautiful. Sara, I'm going to give you the last word here. We began with you. We wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for your hard work and putting the report together with your team. So what's next on the Galen Growth Horizon? What's your next report we can look forward to?
We have our half-year reports coming out. The second week of July, we will be publishing globally what's going on, and then focusing on specifically on Asia Pacific, on North America, and on Europe. And this year, we're really excited to bring out data on Africa and understanding who's innovating in Africa, who's innovating and bringing their innovation into a very needy part of the world. So that's what's next. That I'm busy working on.
I'm looking forward to that. Sara, Tal, Dave, Dr. Albert, Julien, I want to thank you all for being with us today. I think anybody who sees this video going forward will almost have like a mini MBA program of what's happening in our category. I thank you so very much. I thank all of our attendees, our participants in today's program for joining us. And again, I think, Julien, this webinar will go onto the Galen Growth YouTube channel. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I look forward to receiving a copy, and we'll be sharing that out with everyone. Thank you all so much for participating today. Take care and goodbye, and be healthy.
Thank you very much, everyone.